Well, welcome to Tim's Take and another podcast. And today we have Dr. Allison Meyer, who is a beef nutritionist in the Division of Animal Sciences at the University of Missouri. Welcome, Allison.
Thanks, Tim. I appreciate you having me on.
We're so excited to have you here. And before we dig deep into what we're going to talk about, where are you from and how did you wind up here at Missouri?
Well, I'm originally from South Central Indiana. I grew up on a small cow-calf operation. My parents both have outside jobs. So I always joke, if you take a hog buyer, an ag business owner, and a school teacher, and you give them cows for fun, you get me.
All right.
And so I essentially grew up, my brother and I both, as our parents hired hands. They didn't actually hire anyone until we left for college. And I loved the cows and loved the science aspect of it, and was lucky that when I got to Michigan State, where I did my undergrad degree, that I got involved in some research and realized that I wanted to do research and become a professor. So I first came to Mizzou when I did my master's here with Monty Curley, and then a couple of grazing projects that Rob Cullenbach was really involved in. And then I went to North Dakota State for my PhD and got started into this line of research, some with sheep, some with cattle. My first job was at the University of Wyoming, where I had a really similar position, and then I've been back here for about 9.5 years.
Oh, great. Well, we're glad to have you back.
Thanks.
It's great. That's great. So, tell us about what you're going to talk about, because it's very timely, extremely timely.
I think so. So what my lab does is we really research how nutrition and management of cows, especially in late pregnancy and lactation, impact their calves and them. And we're really interested in how we can improve health, survival, and performance of pre-weaning calves through taking better care of the cow herd.
Okay. So, and it's that last trimester, it's where you're really focusing today.
Yeah, we spend a lot of time doing some work on the nutrition of the last 3-4 months of pregnancy as fetal growth really increases in beef cattle. And that's, I think, because it's a time that we often overlook, but there's a time of a lot of nutrient needs.
Okay. But aren't we in some of the lowest nutrient availability that we have?
Yeah, so one of the hard things about, really if we think about how we've organized calving seasons in the U.S. is we generally try to calve cows into good forage. Mm-hmm. But that means that we often have them in late pregnancy when there's not very good forage. And that's true both for fall and spring calving. If we think about spring calving cows, they're generally gestating now in the winter. And so we either are, letting them maybe graze some stockpiled forages or winter ranges, or poor quality often baled forages. Or if we even think about fall calving in the summer, fall calving, they are in late gestation in the summer, and so they are experiencing a lot of heat stress, some summer slump, especially of our cool season grasses like tall fescue, and often some lower quality forage, even if there's a fair bit of quantity. And so for both of those calving seasons, we have high nutrient needs that are actually combined with times of low nutrient availability. Now, the nice thing is that usually to calve into September or October, you have quite a bit of grass to eat as a lactating cow. And if you say calve in March or April, you're calving into some spring growth. Or maybe producers save their better hay or plan to supplement in lactation. But sometimes we forget about that late gestational time period because the cows are already pregnant and we're not worried about calving yet. We're not worried about getting them pregnant. And so maybe we, don't really forget about them, but we don't work quite as hard to make sure we meet their nutrient requirements.
Because the graph that you shared with me really shows that the energy and protein that they need increases tremendously. And if the producer's not supplementing more, you're going to fall behind.
Definitely. So in the last, 90, 120 days of pregnancy, a cow's going from needing less than 10% of her total energy and protein requirements that she's putting towards her fetus to, being about a third, even 40% in the last month. And so really she's starting to allocate more and more of what she consumes to her fetus. And many times she's doing that at her own expenses. So she's actually mobilizing her own body condition, or maybe even, catabolizing some of her muscle, breaking down her muscle so that she can make sure she gets those amino acids, those protein building blocks to her fetus.
Wow. So if you started out in October with a feeding regime, you better increase it throughout the winter then for your cows and heifers.
Yeah. So, part of it depends on what you're feeding in October, but, understand that the requirements are increasing. And so it might be that what you're feeding in October is great, but you certainly don't want to fall off. And what happens a lot in, tall fescue-based systems is that rather than actually increasing nutrient quality, then we have cows go from being, in the fall and eating fall growth, which is awesome. I mean, fall growth of fescue is great nutritionally, to then, if there's no stockpile tall fescue to go to, they might be going to eating summer baled fescue hay. And a lot of the summer baled fescue hay we put up in Missouri is just not very high quality.
Right.
And so they're going from, maybe getting more than they need right after their calves have been weaned, to then getting less than they need. And a good thing about cows is that they are able to store, some nutrients for later. They're really good at storing energy. Most ruminants are. So a nice thing is if we wean our calves and our cows are a little thin, when they're still in mid-gestation, they can put on quite a bit of condition if we need them to. But the problem is that they can only do so much later, and we're not good at storing protein. In order to get protein for the fetus, if we're not giving enough to the cow, then the cow has to actually, like I said, break down her own protein. And so that's why a lot of thin cows end up looking like they're losing their muscle. And it's because they really are. They're starting to, take away muscle and not put it back so that they can use that.
So if we do underfeed, what's the consequences?
There's lots of consequences. It kind of depends on where we want to look. But in my lab, we really are interested in what's happening pre-weaning. And the reason that I've really decided to focus there is that impacts every producer. So there's a lot of data to show that, undernutrition, poor nutrition during late pregnancy can actually result in, lower weaning weights, as well as poor feedlot performance, lower fertility, that sort of thing. But we've really focused mostly on young calves through weaning because, again, whether you retain heifers or not, whether you retain ownership of calves in the feedlot, whether you just sell your calves at the sale barn the day you wean them, it impacts you how many calves are alive and how big they are at weaning. And so we really have been focusing on things that affect calves' ability to survive. So we know that the time that the calves are most likely to die is within the first 3 weeks of life. So actually about a third of the calves that die pre-weaning die on the first day of life, a third between 24 hours and 3 weeks, and then the next third between 3 weeks and 6-7 months of age. So really, if we can get them through that first few weeks, month, then they can usually survive to weaning. And so we've been really interested in all the things that poor nutrition or other management during late gestation, how that impacts that calf when it's really young, so that it can get off to a good start and survive.
So when we talk about size, I grew up with the inclination that we wanted small calves that were born small, but then they really grew fast. Can that happen?
Good question. So, one of the real challenges here is that, in general, cow-calf producers think smaller is better always for calves. And what I always challenge them to think about is that if they want to change the birth weight of their calves, they need to do it by selecting different bulls, not by starving their cows. So change birth weight with genetics, not with a feed bucket. And some producers got really worried about feeding extra birth weight into their calves. But the thing is that really, unless the calves were produced through IVF production, they're not going to overgrow their birth weight. They have a genetic set point for that birth weight. And so our goal is we want them to be the size they wanted to be. If not, then it's kind of like a preemie baby. So we don't like hearing when people have 3-pound babies because we know something's wrong with that baby. we don't want calves that are born at 30 pounds. We don't also want calves that are born at 60 if they wanted to be 80, because probably their development wasn't quite right. They may have been born early, but many times it means that their development, wasn't actually to the level it was supposed to be. And so they're kind of immature. And actually, they could have less muscle fibers than they should. So interestingly, muscle fiber number is actually determined of a calf before it's born. And so how big its muscle can be is really, really impacted by, how much it grows as a fetus.
Yeah, because you mentioned the muscle, but also the calf's internal organs are being developed during this last time also, aren't they?
Definitely. And if we think about that, there's a lot of important organs that are developing there, especially in late pregnancy, because the calf is getting ready to go from getting almost everything through the blood, through its umbilical cord, get that cut off, and then have to figure it out on its own. And if we think about it, a calf is more, I always joke with the students, it's more independent than they were until they were 18 at like an hour of age, right? Because that calf has to get up and it has to, stand really quickly, and then it has to find food and follow its mother around, because it's not particularly safe if it's by itself, right? And so if we think about that, it has to go, from getting everything through the blood, including oxygen, to being able to use its lungs, use its guts as soon as it's born. And so, really we're worried about lung and gut development, because they're also two of the places where they're most likely to have disease or pathogens. If you think about scours in the GI tract, and then of course respiratory disease in the lungs. But there's another tissue that's developing then as well, and it's called brown adipose tissue. And it's kind of a little heater that each calf has or lamb has when it's born. And essentially it's fat that has extra ability to make heat. It doesn't make as much energy, but it makes a lot of heat and helps keep a calf born. So especially for our spring-born calves that are born when it's cold, they essentially need to have more of this brown fat so that they can actually make it through, cold conditions, because they're born wet, and they're many times born outside. And the only thing that can dry them off is a cow's tongue and time. And so if you think about it, they're really having to generate a lot of their own heat to stay warm enough.
That brown fat, that sounds familiar. Isn't that what reptiles have?
I'll admit that I only really know much about mammals.
I remember in biochemistry talking about brown fat in crocodiles.
Yeah.
That's why they can react so quickly.
Yeah, so there is brown fat in a lot of other species too. But from a cattle ruminant standpoint, it's especially early or important really early in their life. Like, it's not impacting a cow much, but for a calf, especially born in the cold, it's really important.
And that gives them that energy, like you mentioned.
Yeah, especially just to keep warm.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because our spring calves are often born on the coldest days of the year.
They are. It's funny. Here we say that spring is anywhere between, Christmas and Easter, sometimes even after it in this part of the country.
Right. And it gets back to management of how you want to take advantage of the forage that year, but also, I guess, markets too. When do I want to sell this calf or what, and when prices are higher and
and traditionally, a lot of emphasis and calving times has really been chosen by that. But a lot of times people that are actually doing the work want to choose by when they can actually best keep calves alive. And I like to challenge producers to consider, if your facilities are not really prepared for calving in a certain time of year, even if all of your neighbors say that's best or an economist says that's best. If more of your calves die, you have less to sell, and that's not good for your bottom line. And so, it's a really operation-specific choice of when calving is the best, and it has a lot to do with, how you want to nutritionally manage your cows and heifers, but also what your facilities are.
Right. Like if you're just going to be out in the pasture with no help, you may want to be a little bit later in the season.
Yeah, or, a lot of, I think, producers in Missouri have moved to fall calving because, provided you've got some shade, really it's a lot easier to let cows do the work and not worry as much about dealing with inclement weather. Whereas sometimes in April, we can end up with a snowstorm or really, cold snap that can knock some calves.
And then, like you said, in the fall, we need to worry about, okay, the quality of the forage is getting lower now. The legumes are probably played out by now. We need the...
Yeah, and we've actually, we just published a paper where we compared 4 calving seasons in the fall, so 4 of our mostly September-based calving seasons here at the bee farm at South Farm, and 4 spring calving seasons. So really their average calving date was in middle of February. And as we compared them, the thing is that we had very different challenges. So calves were smaller born in the fall, which we generally know is true. But they also appeared to be less metabolically stressed, except that they were a little more likely to be dehydrated, which makes some sense. If we think about the spring-born calves, they were a little bigger, but they took a little longer to stand up, probably because they were cold. And then they had a lot of indication of cold stress and really, showing that they were trying to generate enough energy, but probably the cold was just making that a challenge.
And from what you shared with me, energy and protein go together. They need equal amounts of both.
Yeah, in general they do, though. The time when that really comes apart, though, is during cold stress. So during cold stress, animals need more energy to try to do thermogenesis or to essentially make heat through shivering and, getting their hair as puffed out as possible and things like that. But the thing is that when we think about it, beef cattle can withstand a fair bit of cold, but they have limits to that. And so even cows, even though today it's beautiful and sunny, it's still pretty cold. And so our cows are actually starting to increase their energy use just to keep themselves warm enough, to keep their bodies within the right temperature. Calves have an even harder time with that because they're small, and so they have more surface area. They have more ability to lose heat than they do to generate it. And that's where really small calves are really concerning when they're born in the spring, because the smaller a calf is, the more likely it is to get cold, but also the less stores it has.
Sure.
And with baby calves, you compound all of this because colostrum, doesn't necessarily always have a really high yield or a lot of nutrients. And a lot of our recent data have shown that, we can actually, cows are pretty good at making sure there's enough antibodies or immunoglobulins to provide passive transfer of immunity to calves. But when those don't take a hit, nutrients usually do. And so we have calves that just aren't getting that many nutrients from colostrum. So they're not getting that much protein, they're not getting that much lactose, which is milk sugar, and they're not getting that much fat. And so that means they're having to use even more of their own, which is hard on them.
Sure. And corn is probably one of the best energy sources. Grain.
For for animals once they're ruminating, obviously not baby calves, but for cows and heifers in this part of the country, many times we do think of corn as being one of our better energy sources. It's got a lot of starch. The great thing though about ruminants is that they're able to utilize a lot of fiber. And so, many times when we think about supplementing cows, it's not like we're stuck with corn, because this is why we can use great things like soy hulls.
Oh, okay.
Mostly fiber, coating that comes off of a soybean. And even distillers' grains, we think about them as being high in protein, but, a lot of what isn't protein is fiber. And for a beef cow, it can actually be a pretty good energy source too.
So good quality fiber is wow.
Yeah, if the fiber is digestible, there's a lot of benefit to feeding a highly digestible fiber along with a forage. In fact, it doesn't have as much competition with fermentation. The rumen environment's actually a little bit better in many ways.
So, like you mentioned before we started talking about summer round bales of cool season grasses aren't always the best. And that's what, if you're feeding that, then you're going to have to come in with a soy hull or something that could a bit more energy.
Yeah, so there's a lot of options. Certainly, if producers have poor quality forage, or especially tall fescue that's baled, I feel like it's pretty easy to make up for that. Either through also feeding some better quality forage, because that's an option, or using a feed bucket. And really, there's lots of options. I often encourage producers just to talk with a local elevator or feed mill about commodity blends. A nice thing about using, commodity blends is that many times they're trying to keep some nutritional specs, but fluctuating exactly what's in them to keep a price point lower. And beef cows are really able to utilize a lot of different things, and it's not like it's one size fits all. Sometimes people get frustrated because after a talk, they'll ask me, well, what should I do? And I say, you have lots of choices. You just have to pick what you like the best.
Right. And you can go on the markets.
Mm-hmm.
Like a few years ago, soy hulls were cheap.
Mm-hmm.
Now they're not. You can go back and forth. So we've talked a lot about this late trimester, this third trimester, and the importance of it. And we ended up talking about energy, increasing the energy. But you said there's also a difference between stockpiled in the field versus hay. Let's dig a little bit more into that.
Yeah. So of course, here in Missouri, we have this wonderful and terrible forage that we love and hate. Tall fescue. And I know during my master's work, we did some work comparing stockpiled tall fescue versus hay with or without supplement for spring calving cows. And we weren't really focused too much on effects on the calf of the cow. We just were interested in utilization of the forage and how the cows performed. So when I came back here, one of the first things I wanted to do was see, how we were really affecting fetal growth, and then also, calf metabolism and some questions about calf survival. And so what we found is that, stockpiled tall fescue is really an ideal forage source for spring calving cows. So, if you have enough of it, it provides plenty of protein, actually probably a little more than they have to have. And in general, it's so much more digestible than a lot of the summer baled hay that we have that, our cows were able to maintain body condition score much better on stockpile versus hay. And then they actually, those calves that were born to the cows that only got the poor quality hay actually had 10% lower birth weights. And so again, that's a bad thing if we think about it, because they didn't meet their genetic potential. And we didn't have any dystocia problems in either of our groups. And so, we weren't causing any calving problems with the stockpile. And I'll say that in that project, we actually didn't let them calve on stockpile because we were collecting a lot of data from the calves. But during my master's work, we found that we had better calf survival on stockpile. And part of that probably was just because of the lack of mud. So many times when we're feeding hay, we've got some muddy areas around hay rings, and we've got cattle that are more congested, even if they're on pasture. But in stockpile, when you're strip grazing it, you're really encouraging them to use, different areas of the pasture, and calves stayed a lot healthier during those projects. And so, I think that for our spring calving cows, stockpile tall fescue is really a wonderful resource. And it doesn't necessarily mean having to use a feed bucket. It's just shifting when you use those forage resources.
And I once heard a forage person say, feed your hay first and your stockpiled tall fescue last. Is that right?
So if you think about it, for a spring calving cow, that makes a lot of sense. When Justin Sexton was still here in Extension, that's when we were running these projects. And so we actually devised a system where we were using that poor quality forage right after we weaned calves. We supplemented the cows a little bit if necessary, but that meant essentially before their nutrient requirements really went up, we were using that hay. We had those cows in dry lots in October, which seemed weird to people. But the nice thing is that we were letting that stockpile accumulate. And then once the first frost came, we started them out on the stockpile. And that's when their requirements were really going up, and they had that better quality forage. And so I think that works really, really, really well for spring calving cows. Now, that doesn't work for fall calving cows, because if you think about it, fall calving cows really need better quality forage after they calve. And so, letting fall calving cows actually consume pasture as it isn't a bad thing. And definitely, Rob Cullenbach has a lot of previous research showing that fall calving cows can do well on stockpile during the winter also. Sometimes they could use a little supplement, but many times they and their calves do quite well.
So this is really neat because I've been talking to several producers who want a total grazing system, no grain. And so by managing your forages with stockpiled, you can really meet those requirements, even in a cow-calf operation.
Yeah, I mean, the hard part about that is that there's years like this where this wasn't a very good year for stockpile. And so, I mean, one of the things that I think I'm really here to say that is a good follow-up to your last podcast with Eric Bailey is that we do have to keep in mind that, especially while cows are pregnant, if we don't feed them well, we're going to have problems when they calve. And we're probably going to have problems in keeping their calves alive and getting them rebred. And so we need to have some kind of backup. And whenever anyone tells me that they never want to use any sort of resource, I think to myself, give it time. You'll probably get over that. Because when we have cows, we have, I feel like, made a pact with them when we make sure they get pregnant, that we are going to take care of them and their offspring. And we need to make sure they have something to eat. And so sometimes that means you need to have some stores, just like you put things in your pantry that maybe aren't your favorite to eat, but if there's a snowstorm, you have those canned beans. Sometimes we need to have some forage around that is harvested that we can use. Even stockpile, cows can't eat it through an inch of ice. And so if you have an ice storm, you've got to have something for them. But I think it's important to remember that in times like this, when we have drought, we often need to have some backup plans. And I think, that's what makes managing cows so difficult and so interesting, is that you can have one plan, but you got to have another plan and another plan. It's like the Eisenhower quote, plans are nothing, but planning is everything. I may have paraphrased it. I think sometimes it's less important to hold fast to these were my plans, I'm going to stick to them, and more to the idea that you need to have a plan and you need to do that planning. But with cattle, it has to have a backup for if Mother Nature doesn't follow through.
Yeah, you can't take all the tools out of your toolbox.
You can't. And I'll say that many times if I talk to producers who are battling calf problems, many times their management system worked really well until it didn't. So maybe it was a drought year. Maybe it was an overly wet year. Maybe it was a year when they happened to have scours go through. And normally their calves would have been fine, but instead that year they lost a third of them. I'll say that something I think that's important to remember, especially for everybody out there who's taking care of the cattle themselves, it's not only hard on you economically when calves die, but it's really, really bad for your psyche. People hate watching babies die. And when they know that not only is the calf dying, but it's losing my ability to sell it later, and now I've paid for keeping its mother around, and I've got essentially just all this sunk cost, it's just really bad. And I mean, I've had conversations where I listened to people and couldn't help but, wonder how they were managing to go through the rest of their calving season because they'd lost half the calves that had been born. And probably it's just because of poor nutritional management of their cows during pregnancy.
And we may be blaming the cow for missing a cycle when it was really us, like a lack of feed.
Well, and that's the other thing is rarely do we go from a cow calving to just feeding her everything in the world. And if she's thin when she calves, she's also lactating. And so, her body's telling her to prioritize the calf that she has before it is to get pregnant for the next one. And so she's going to keep trying to lactate, and it's hard to put condition back on her. We found that, if we are very closely monitoring thin cows after they calve, we can get them pregnant, but it takes a lot of feeding them well. And that's not something that, if you think about this year, for example, if cows calve thin, unless you've got a bunch of hay and supplement set aside, well, they're probably not going to get that much better forage than they did before. And so then they're going to be thin. Their calves are probably going to be weaker. They're probably not going to come back in heat as fast. They'll probably get bred later. It's just affecting everything.
You've pushed that out months now. Now, instead of having February calves, you've got May calves.
Yeah.
The next year because of that. And sure. Before we leave stockpile tall fescue, does it have the end of fight issues as the hay does?
So certainly it depends, but a nice thing is that, fall growth of fescue does not have a seed head. Right. And so, there's some differences in where the end of fight really is in seed versus leaf. Definitely there's, you can find plenty of ergovaline in it, but I'll say that it's been used successfully in research trials and by producers around the state in spring and fall calving cows. And to me, the ability to stockpile in the fall is one of the best things about tall fescue because it really is just a better quality forage. And the nice thing about fescue is it has that waxy outer coat that allows it to maintain its quality even into March, whereas a lot of cool season grasses have similar fall growth, but they start to deteriorate as they get snow and ice and things like that. And so, it's just really, it's a pretty great forage, I think.
That's interesting. Like you said, people, they hate it. Mm-hmm. But my father-in-law, it was cattle all of his life. He loved it. He said he was amazed what it could do because he grew up with having Timothy and bluegrass and orchard grass, all he had. Mm-hmm. And people wish they could have that, but you don't get that stockpile. You don't get that.
Yeah, and a lot of those forages aren't nearly as, they're not nearly as resistant to drought and poor soil and poor drainage and overgrazing. I also, I grew up where fescue was more of a weed in the part of Indiana that's not totally fescue belt. And so I'll say that I didn't really see the major benefits until I came here. I think that, as I said with everything, there's really pluses and minuses. If I were going to buy a large tract of land and a bunch of cows here in Missouri, I would try to use the benefits of fescue and try to make sure that I manage away from some of the problems, but I would not try to eradicate it.
That has to be your base.
Yeah, I think that it has so many positives for this area that it just makes sense to exploit the benefits and, like I said, try to lessen all the evils.
So we've shown that affects the mother is that if she's underfed, she's gonna go in thinner. It could delay her being rebred, and so you have those issues. But now the calf that you want to keep back as a heifer, maybe the breeder, you have issues there too.
Yeah. So first of all, let's keep in mind that if we have a cow that calves thin, she's also probably going to make less colostrum and less milk. And then her calf is probably a little smaller than it should have been. And it's got less groceries to eat after it's born. And so, many times those calves weigh less at weaning. So in our last project where we did this, they weighed about 13% less than the calves from the females that have been fed well to meet their requirements. And there's definitely some data out there, especially some from Rick Funston's lab in Nebraska, that shows that, heifers can have delayed puberty and lower fertility if their dams were fed poorly in late pregnancy. Interestingly, there's not a lot of data on the bull side, but we castrated our bull calves late in one of our recent projects and found that testis size was actually smaller per unit of body weight. So in the calves whose mothers have been nutrient restricted in late pregnancy, they weighed less, but their testes weighed even less. And so we think that probably if we'd maintained them as intact bulls, that they may have potentially had lower fertility. And we actually have saved some samples so we can go back and ask some of those questions. It's not something we get to ask a lot because we don't keep a lot of bulls around. Right. So, but there's some work in Canada that shows that if you, if bull calves have less milk, so this is using, a lot of dairy calves, if they have access to less milk pre-weaning, that they actually are lower fertility long term. And so it all kind of makes sense that, big picture, we're impacting that generation of the herd really forever.
Yes. Speaking of that, I've even heard that if you starve a cow for nutrients, the next 2 or 3 generations, they'll keep showing up.
Yeah, so it's interesting, through a lot of scientific research, not just with livestock, but with humans and with
Yes.
mice and rats, we've really gotten to understand the idea of epigenetics. And that just means that we actually can put some extra marks on our genome that we actually can pass down to the next generation. And probably that's what's happening in this sort of thing. So when we see that, one generation gets stressed in utero and that affects their offspring, some of it has to do with their development physiologically, but some of it probably has to do with these epigenetic marks. And I'll say that we don't understand them as well in cattle, but I know my lab's working with Rocio Rivera's lab here at MU, and we are asking some more of those questions in some of these nutrient restriction and other models.
Yeah, I heard one time that if your grandmother was stressed, it affects your health.
Yeah, it's really interesting. If we think about it, some of these things are actually adaptation where we're trying to make the next generation stronger. We're trying to get them ready for what they're going to meet. But the problem is that, not all those adaptations work. And at the end of the day, there's only so many nutrients to go around. And the mother does need to actually maintain herself. She gets that physiologically. And so she might give less nutrients to her offspring, and then they don't develop quite right. And if they don't develop quite right, then that can affect what they give to their offspring, and then you can see how it can keep going.
Yes. Now we've been using cattle as the focus. This is the same as lambs also, isn't it?
Oh yeah, and really any species. It's a little easier to see exactly what's happening in our species that have, 1, 2, 3. We get into pigs, these things happen, but we also have a lot of natural variation within a litter. You can have, big piglets and then little runts. But, actually a lot of my PhD work was in sheep. And so a lot of the work we're currently doing in cattle is confirming that what happens in sheep also happens in cattle. It's interesting. Sheep are a really good model for human pregnancy. And so they get used with a lot of biomedical work. But they also get used as a model for cattle because it's not as easy to work with beef cows when they calve. And so my lab gets chased around a lot, and we have to deal with a lot of not perfect conditions to collect the data we do. It's a lot easier with sheep. So,
Right. Well, this has been fascinating. And I think it also shows how your basic research affects producers. You have to get the basic research down, and then you can take that to the next level.
Yeah, I think so. And, somebody who prefers to wear boots and hang out with cows, I'll say that, sometimes people say that what I'm doing isn't necessarily that practical, but I'll say that everything we learn can be used by cow-calf producers in one way or another. And I understand that we can't always manage cows and heifers perfectly, but if we keep in mind what we're doing to them and to their calves, we can actually help our operations. And, we have to take the science and the economics and the realities of logistics and droughts and labor and everything else all together. But I do think it's important to remember that, we've got to manage late gestation, late pregnancy, and early lactation cows and heifers well if we want their calves to do well. We want them to, survive to weaning. And if we want to keep those cows and heifers around in our herd, get them bred back for next year.
Yes. One final thing from me. I'm a plant physiologist, nutritionist, and when you say nutrients, I think of calcium and phosphorus and potassium. Those are important too.
Oh, definitely. And we actually, we did some trace mineral work, copper, zinc, and manganese work a few years ago too. And I'll say that, we definitely know that it's not just about protein and energy. The reason that I've mostly focused on that and what I've talked about today is that, many times our biggest issues with beef cows are just providing enough quality forage. And that is, protein and energy is our first problem. Definitely, it's also important to keep in mind that providing, macro minerals like calcium, phosphorus, also trace minerals like copper, zinc, and vitamins are all really important during pregnancy and after. In fact, as vitamin A prices went up and, it started coming out of some some mineral mixes more than others. Certainly I know I saw some more retained placentas. Turns out vitamin A nutrition has a lot to do with reproduction, and usually vitamin A deficiencies will result in retained placentas, which aren't great for breed back either. So, it's definitely not just a one nutrient thing. And, I know from our work that we know that the minerals fed to the cows during pregnancy actually impact the mineral stores that their calves have when they're born. And they need those for tissues to work, for their immune system to work, for all kinds of important things. And in fact, there's a lot of that in cattle that we don't totally understand yet because, it just takes a lot of research.
Because I've seen some folks talk about free choice minerals, have a wide assortment of minerals, and the cow can almost dictate what she needs.
Maybe. I mean, I'll
Yeah,
say
exactly.
that.
We can't.
Yeah. I'm not always 100% sure that a cow can taste the difference between, copper oxide and zinc oxide. Maybe she can. I think the big thing, and when producers ask me about this, what mineral should I use, I always tell them that that's something that they have to decide with their pocketbook and their cow herd. And if they feel really comfortable using an expensive mineral and vitamin source that maybe others wouldn't use, but they feel like they're getting something out of it, that's cool. If they feel like using the cheapest one available is doing what it should be doing for them, there's some benefit there. I think it's especially important in a state like Missouri where we've got all kinds of cow-calf producers. We've got some that, just need somebody to graze down the little bit of land behind their house. And we've got some that have 1,000 cows, and we have some that raise $100,000 bulls regularly. And, we have some that just want to sell their calves at weaning. So they've got a little extra money to put back into fence upkeep. Everybody needs something a little different. And I'll say that the more your genetics are worth and the more you feel like each animal's worth, probably the more you need to spend on inputs and the more you want to make sure your animals are meeting that genetic potential. But, there's often a lot of push for AIing, ester synchronization, selecting better bulls. That only works if you manage your animals to meet those genetics later. And that management is often nutrition.
I have one more final nutrient question.
Okay.
I've been hearing from our human food nutritionists that copper is a big thing for humans that we're not getting enough of. Are you seeing that because you mentioned copper once or twice?
So copper actually often is relatively low in some of our forages, especially some of our harvested forages. I know that when we were doing that mineral study that was sponsored by Novus a few years ago, we had a few different lots of hay that had been harvested at various places on South Farm, and we had a big fluctuation in copper, and most of it didn't meet requirements. Copper is important for a lot of different enzymes and proteins as cofactors. It does all kinds of things. And so, when I think about minerals that cow-calf producers especially need to worry about, copper, zinc, and selenium are usually the first three that I think about.
All right. Thank you so much. I've learned so much.
Good.
I love talking about this type of thing, and we really thank you. And we look forward to hearing some more about this. And our producers, can they contact you?
Yeah, they're absolutely welcome. Usually the easiest thing is to email me. My email is meyerall@missouri.edu, meyerall@missouri.edu, or they can look me up online.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Allison.
You're welcome.
And thank you for listening, and we'll see you next time on Tim's Take.